Okay, looks like we are live today. And hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mission Top. Today is a little bit of a darker day outside here at Mission Top, a little bit overcast. I have had to deal with a little bit of those challenges with light, but it's a little bit fitting as we have a little more of a mysterious ambiance here in order to dive into the mysteries of temples, if you will. But the first thing I do is always give a little explanation of what Mission Top is, in as much as the name of the channel and the content on it isn't self-explanatory. So Mission Top is a farmstead and a ranch. It's a place, but it's much more than that. It is a family. It is a place of ideas. It is a world in and of itself. And in many ways, I'm even going to say it's a temple, or at least I'm trying to, or we as a family, as the heads of Mission Top, you could say, are trying to pattern it like a temple. And why would we do that? Well, that's where this series comes into play, and what exactly a temple is, and why I'm claiming that temples are something that everyone in humanity, I think, should strive to understand, whether it has something to do with your own religious tradition or not. My claim in this series is that temples have been pretty much ubiquitous across humanity, and so they continue to exist even today. We think of them as something ancient, but my claim, as I've tried to give some evidence for, is that we continue to build temples today. Not just like in my faith tradition, which is that of the Latter-day Saints, which has actual religious temples, but in the fact that we kind of have convinced ourselves that we're not as religious today. We build all sorts of temples and we don't even realize, right, that they're temples. So what is their importance, and why is it relevant to all of us to understand what a temple is? And to get to that, a good thing would be to recap the last episode where we said that temples are maps of meaning. And I laid out how, if you can imagine yourself in a landscape, a desert landscape with no point of reference, right? You wouldn't know where you were at all, or where you should go if you had absolutely no points of reference. And even more than that, in order to go where you want to go, you have to know what it is you want and who you are, right? So the last episode was all about how that is the function of temples. That is, I think, why our ancestors built them in stone to last for across time, for millennia, as many have, is because they were trying to leave us, in essence, a gift, a map, to say, look, to this point, this is the best we've been able to figure out. This is the map of, not a physical map, of GPS coordinates, but a map of meaning. This is who you are, right? This is where you are in terms of who you are and where you are. This is where you want to go. Okay, and once you know that, well, then life becomes a lot easier, right? Because then each day you can judge where you are in life by where you want to go, and who you are now. To maybe also a temple presents to you who you want to become, or what you are, as far as not just yourself, but as what kind of people you belong to. So temples have been those maps that bring together, and in a symbolic presentation or symbolic world, which we're going to talk about today, give people the answers to those questions so that they can then go out into life and know, what to do, in essence. And if that seems kind of trivial to you, like how could that possibly be? Well, just consider the fact that today that is one of the major issues that a lot of people deal with in their lives. They don't know. Of course, we have some basic answers in society of what to do, get an education, get a job, make some money, those kinds of things. But many people feel this hollowness and saying, is that it? Is that all that this life meant? Is that the only meaning that this life has? And they feel a hollowness, like there's something more. But in order to get those answers, they've got to be able to answer these kinds of questions. What more could I be, right? And where do I, what's my ultimate destination? Where did I come from, etc., right? And so that's how the temple tries to answer those questions. But it's a tricky thing, because a temple is not some encyclopedia like you'd find in a computer. It's not Wikipedia. You can just go and type in words and get articles out of it. It deals in a different kind of language. And that's what leads into today's presentation, which is that temples deal with a symbolic language. And the very structure and most elements you can find in a temple, in essence, present to you a symbolic world. And this constitutes this map of meaning that we talked about in the last episode. So if you want to be able to read the map, in essence, you have to be able to understand what symbols are, how they work, and how to draw out the appropriate meaning that symbols are meant to present to you. Okay, so that's where we'll dive into this, right? We've got to first try to identify what is a symbol. And guess what? That's not an easy question. The more I've looked into it, the more I find that different people explain it differently. But I can at least we can talk around it an awful lot, even as I myself am striving for a definition that satisfies me. But we can definitely circle around the concept of a symbol to the point that I think you'll, if not, being able to articulate it perfectly through a definition, you'll at least have much more of a sense of what a symbol is, okay? And once you have those symbols, the cool thing is that you'll see that just as, Jonathan Pajot has titled his whole YouTube channel, The Symbolic World, you'll see that it's not just a temple that contains symbols in the world. Our world is in essence made up of symbols, at least as it presents itself to us in our daily lives. The things that we pay attention to because they have some meaning, as opposed to all the other things out there in the world, in reality, you could say, that we don't pay attention to. We pay attention to those things that have some underlying pattern of meaning to them, and in as much as they contain a pattern of meaning, and that's why we're drawn to them, they are a symbol, as we'll find out, because that's what it means to be a symbol, okay? All right, so to dive into this, let's start by kind of contrasting a symbol with just a sign, because this is one of the fundamental kind of errors I think people make as far as symbols that gets them off onto the wrong path, okay? So when I'm talking about a symbol, think of how music is symbolic. Music is a very good example of symbolism, you could say, right? Because the very nature of music is that this container of sound waves, somehow is able to transmit meaning, right? And it's crazy that music can do that, right? It's almost like one of the purest kind of transmitters of meaning in ways that we can universally understand. I mean, there's some debate whether every culture kind of interprets music the same way, but I think it's pretty universal, kind of the patterns of music. Like, for example, if I wanted to present to you a in sound, right, a triumph, right, I would probably give some music something like this. Da 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 da. And obviously you recognize that's "We Are the Champions," and it transmits a sense of triumph, right? I don't think that any culture could use that as like a melancholy, lover's lament for losing their lover, right? Or something like that. It just wouldn't work. And so you answer, how did that do that? How did sound transmit that meaning, that pattern of meaning to us? Well, music is symbolic. So that already gets us on the right path of how symbols work. And so religions rely very much, almost all religions that I know of rely very much on music because it's such a powerful symbolic transmitter, right? A symbol originally meant to put two things together. So it's almost like you have one thing, something that's kind of even more material or earthly, like a sound wave or something like that, that can then contain something more heavenly, let's say, something unseen, something that belongs more in the realm of meaning, right? And so again, you have this union of heaven and earth together in the form of a symbol. Now, what's a sign then? Okay, so a sign is something much more basic and simple that doesn't at all kind of approach that profundity of a symbol. So, for example, a good sign would be the heart shape, right? That's a sign for love, okay? And so in that, we look at like a heart emoji and we say, oh, that means love. And so you have this one-to-one kind of thing. Heart emoji means love, and it refers you to that. Or like a stop sign refers you to this very specific thing, you're supposed to stop. But a lot of people would say, oh yeah, that's a symbol. And you'd say, in some sense, it all depends how you define symbol. But at the other hand, it doesn't contain nearly as much what music did, as we just said. Whereas music contained a whole pattern of meaning, a rich pattern of meaning that ultimately could, tell you something fundamental about reality. The sign is much more basic, right? And the heart symbol you can know that it stands for love, but does the symbol itself contain the pattern of love per se? Can you look at that symbol of the heart and draw out a greater understanding of love? I don't think you can, right? It's a pretty basic thing. I mean, you could tie it to that it's kind of shaped like the heart in your body, and in as much as in your body, the heart is tied to symbolically to the notions of love. You can go that path, so it's there, but not nearly as much as, let's say, a kiss in terms of love, because think how in a kiss, what's more powerful, right? A heart emoji or a kiss? And think of a kiss as a symbol, right? And so the kiss is obviously much more powerful because it's something that you can actually participate in as well. And again, going back to music, that's the strange thing about music. We can kind of all participate in it and even feel that pattern of meaning. In a way, well, definitely kissing is powerful like that. You're enacting a pattern when you're kissing someone. And so it's very much, as we were talking about, the agent arena relationship of last episode, where so much of our life and its meaning is bound up in the way that we understand kind of our environment and the place we play in it. Well, yeah, KISS gets us into this agent arena relationship where another person is our environment and we're joining with that other person, participating in it, and boom, all these senses and feelings and profound, and it's not just feelings, right? These profound kind of insights and participation and meaning occurs by way of a kiss. Or at least I hope it does, right? When you're kind of just giving that obligatory kiss to your grandma, it's maybe not as powerful, but how about your first kiss or something of somebody that you truly loved, or something like that? That's bound to be much more powerful. Okay, so again, let's, hopefully there you kind of have the sense for the greater profundity of a symbol as compared to a sign. Symbols at their core do have a metaphor to them. But I actually don't like that word metaphor much, because already when we say, symbols are just, they contain a metaphor for something in life, already I think it cheapens what a symbol is. Because when we think of metaphor, we think of just kind of one thing standing for another thing. And, and at least one of those is not really real. They're just kind of standing in the place of the other thing. And so although you'll hear the word metaphor tied up with symbolism, I don't quite love it, because in the end, symbolism is not just a thing of standing in place for another thing. In as much as it gets us to patterns of meaning, and both things, both parts of the metaphor participate in that pattern of meaning. Again, that pattern of meaning is there in both of them. And so this metaphor that's in a symbol, and as I'm saying this, I don't think I'm explaining that right, but just see that the metaphors and symbols are pervasive and profound, right? We have this tendency to trivialize metaphor, and our culture is, so beset by patterns of trivialization of things, that I want us to see that metaphor doesn't quite capture what's also there in a symbol, okay? On the other hand, I want you to see how pervasive kind of this type of metaphorical, symbolic language is contained even within our language, okay? So to see how much like we are symbolic beings. We can't escape this, even if you want to. Even the most like pure scientist that tries to explain things will usually start referring to things like higher order principles, right? And right there, you should have an alarm bell in your mind saying higher. Is there higher order things in science? Is it like higher up? Is it, a ladder? You have to get on a ladder in order to get to that higher thing. You'll see right there was more metaphorical, symbolic language. In as much as this a lecture, I could say I'm halfway through this lecture. Is that, physically precise? No, there's a metaphor, there's a symbol in there. And I could say, I hope you get my point, right? Is there any point here? Is there any pointed object? No, but there's a symbol. I could say, and see what I'm saying. Again, you bring in vision into this, into something that isn't involving physical vision. Some of the things I'm saying are really hard, to get my point, right? There we go again. Or I hope you understand, and think of that word, under and stand, to stand under, or I guess it was like an unterstand is where this word came from, that's meant to stand within, okay? And I hope it's of interest to you. Interest, interesse, to be within something, okay? So I also want you to see that, we are symbolic beings. Our language is just dripping with these kinds of symbolism and metaphor in ways that can hopefully, again, get you to see why it is that you could claim that we live in a symbolic world, and that symbols are deeply, deeply important to humanity, okay? Okay, so let's give just a few more examples of how, a symbol is not a one-for-one equivalent of something else to begin with, that would be more of a sign. So, a lot of people would say, like, look at just a trivial version of a cross, right? Or how about just a little statue of Jesus on the cross, and they'd say, oh, that stands for Jesus, but then they stop there, right? That would be using something more as a sign. But if you say Jesus was, as brought as to the lamb to the slaughter, now you're using this lamb to the slaughter as a symbol for Jesus. And notice the difference, between the two. For just, some statue that you're not really looking into more, that's just kind of standing as a stand-in for Jesus. Whereas the lamb to the slaughter, there brought into it is an experience of you have a sense of what it would be like for a lamb to be brought to the slaughter, even if you've never seen it yourself. You know that there would be blood involved, that there'd be submission involved, that death and would be there, a loss, a death that happens in that. There's a sense of purity to a lamb that we all feel, of gentleness and meekness in a lamb. So you see that why one is very much more a symbol, whereas the other one is just a sign. Now, again, I could go back to a crucifix or a little statue of Jesus, and we could go deeper in that in a symbolic way. But I'm just trying to show you how very often, again, we think a symbol is just a stand-in one for the other, but it's something much more deep, like saying that Jesus is a lamb, to the slaughter, where you're bringing in so much more patterns of information and meaning into the symbol as opposed to the other. Another thing about symbolism is, a lot of times people are trying to decode or a symbol, or kind of tell what it means. So we know that in essence, symbols are kind of containers for deeper meaning or deeper patterns. So how do you know if somebody is interpreting a symbol correctly, right? And that's where what I would say, kind of once again bringing in some principles of like American pragmatism, is to say that on the first step, it must be helpful, okay? To interpret a symbol in some way must, shed some greater understanding, must help you in some way to know how to act more appropriately in the world, or understand some facet of reality more, okay? So in trying to interpret symbolism, you'll get some people that will have some, fairly crazy interpretations, and you have to be able to judge, is that a valid interpretation of a symbol, or is it not? And so again, use that key of saying, well, is it helpful? Does that interpretation bring out some greater understanding of something? Or is it merely seem to be kind of that person's idiosyncratic just kind of view of something that maybe they pulled out of something that they related to, but is not very universal in its understanding. So that's another word that's kind of key to symbolism, is that the symbols that work across humanity deal with things that are universally experienceable, I guess you could say, by humanity. So going back to the lamb to the slaughter, most of humanity has a sense of what an animal, especially like a lamb, would be like being slaughtered, and the basic feelings, the basic experience that would come from being there to lamb to the slaughter. And so there are the appropriate things to bring out. Whereas, a lot of people wouldn't know what the lamb's hoofs were like, per se. So to say like, oh, Jesus, his hands are just like the hoofs of that lamb, you can see right there, if you go down that path, it's not very helpful. What could you say about that? Or what is universal about that people would understand? It's much more difficult to say that that's a valid interpretation, that there's something symbolic about the hoofs of the lamb to Jesus. Like maybe there is. Maybe you could pull out something that worked, that was helpful, but just on the surface, that doesn't seem like it, right? So again, this is a key to be able to judge valid symbolic interpretation from invalid symbolic interpretation. And thank you, Harlan and Martin. I see you guys there on the chat, and thanks for saying hello. And again, feel free to participate, ask any questions along the way. This is kind of some tough stuff, and I realize that it takes a bit of, first you have to have kind of a sense that it's even worth paying attention to, symbolic thinking and applying it to temples. And that's part of my job, is to try to make it, relevant to everyday life, which isn't always apparent how it is on the surface. So I'm glad of those that are willing to give it a shot onto how this might actually be practically useful in life. But my claim is, that symbolic thinking, being able to see the symbolic language of temples is something that will help you broadly across life, in as much as so many things around you in the world present themselves symbolically. Or you can also craft the world around you in a symbolic way, like consciously, by choice. And in as much as you do so, your world will be full more of meaning. So that's what I mean by saying, like, Mission Top, for example, we're trying to build, in essence, like a temple here. Because if we do, then the very structure of how we lay things out here at Mission Top, this farmstead and ranch, we will be living out in a pattern of meaning every day. So here's what I mean by that practically. Like at the center of Mission Top, what should be essentially the center of this farmstead and ranch? Well, of course, that would be our home, right? And we've talked about how even in a home, you have more central places, like the kitchen is the kind of the hearth of the home, more central place. And the bedroom, especially the master bedroom, is kind of like almost the holy of holies, the most, central, sacred part, inner part, you could say, of Mission Top. And so around our house here, then we want, we're going to have a little more manicured and, lawn and garden kind of space around us. Out from that would be places where there are animals and things like that. And then out from that, on the peripheries of Mission Top, we're going to keep more of a wilderness kind of buffer or barrier, preserve a place for the margin where kind of wild things can inhabit and new possibility can emerge. We can learn more about how things interact naturally, without so much of our involvement in them. And so in as much as we set up Mission Top like that, and in many other ways, then it will be set up like a temple, because the temple is set up in very much the same way. And so our daily participation in Mission Top will be full of these patterns of meaning that don't just apply to Mission Top, but apply to our very lives as well. Because as I've tried to say many times, like, you yourself are set up the same way that I just presented. You have a periphery, a wild kind of animalistic periphery. You have a heart, at your very center, an essence of you, and you have various other parts of you that are all, composing your makeup, some more sacred and essential than others that are more peripheral and marginal to who you are. So that's all to say that, yes, if you can start to understand the way that symbolic worlds are set up, it can apply across any domain in life. And Martin asks, is Mission Top, is that where you live? So yes, this is the farmstead and ranch that we're trying to develop over time here as a family, as a temple, as a living being, you could say, because it's we're going to talk about today how anything that exists, including a temple or a mountain or anything else, is composed of all these parts brought into a whole. And it's especially things that are full of life, are living, breathing things. So you yourself are an example of that. Your family is an example of that. But a whole farmstead and ranch like we have is this great, composite being that is many things, but it's also one thing, in as much as we're going to bring it together and make it one thing, as it were. Okay, so let's move on to another facet of symbolism, and that is that symbols are words or images or actions, or as we've said, even sound, in terms of music can be symbols. So symbols are things that are a means of condensing a much greater amount of information into a more compact and efficient form or container or body. And so they do this by a correspondence of the pattern of the greater amount of information to the pattern of the container. And if that sounds kind of abstract, so let's get into examples of what I mean by that. So when you look at a temple, it's just a building there, and you kind of look at it and you have a sense for it. You've seen plenty of pictures of temples. You've probably visited some of them. And you have to ask yourself, how much information is contained within that temple? Like if you were to start writing books about what's contained within the temple, how many books could be written? And so that's a very interesting thing, because the more that you study temples and get into them, you'll start learning that people have literally written thousands of books about temples. And even one individual temple might have, again, dozens, hundreds of books written about it. And so that's a very strange thing, because you look at this building, this container, and somehow that container contains literally volumes of information. How does that do that? And again, we're coming back to it. It does it through symbols. And so that's one of the attributes of a symbol, is that it is possible to contain all sorts of information within it in a very small package, you could say. Okay, and so let's kind of show this. Instead of just saying this, let's actually show it so that you can see exactly how this works. So let's say you were going to try to package a temple, kind of describe a temple, and get all the information that you can about a temple in just one word. Okay, obviously we have the word temple, but let's say you were forced to use a different word in order to describe all the information that you have ever learned about that is contained within a temple. All the volumes that I was just talking about. What would that word be? And when you start looking around at temples, it turns out that there's at least two very good words to describe nearly every temple in one word by something that's intimately familiar to pretty much everybody on earth. Because I said, symbols have to be universal. So here's the two words: mountain and house. Okay? And even when you come to the Latter-day Saint temple, and as much as, I use it as an example oftentimes in this series, the Latter-day Saint temple, written on it, or in scripture, or in common parlance within Latter-day Saints, they refer to the temple as the mountain of the Lord. And written on the house, on the temple itself, it says the house of the Lord, essentially the house of God. But that is not just a Latter-day Saint thing. Pretty much every temple is, across humanity, is compared to a mountain, is said to be a literal mountain. And as you look at this image here next to me, you can see how most temples, like literally most temples across humanity, across places of societies that haven't been in touch with each other for thousands of years, you will find this same shape of a mountain. So that's why I use this image today. And so we're going to transfer over and just look at the shape of a mountain as we go from here. So why would that be the case? We could do this whole thing. We could do this whole thing with house too, but we're going to stick with mountain to say, how is it that this word mountain, or this concept of a mountain, could contain volumes and volumes of information about a temple, such that people would see a mountain as a symbol for a temple, kind of a stand-in. And even there's all sorts of accounts that mountains have just been the actual temples themselves for so many peoples across humanity. Why would that work? And how does that work? Okay, so in order to understand that, what you have to do is ask yourself, what is your experience of a mountain? Okay, and if you just think about that, so when you see a mountain there, or when you've been by one, or when you've been on one, what is your experience of that mountain? And let's start making a list, at least the list that came to me, in as much as I love mountains and and have been on them many a time. What is that I actually experience when I'm on a mountain? Okay, so one would be that mountains are a structure of ascent. All right. Another would be that they evoke an experience of power to me as something bigger than myself. And in as much as a mountain definitely is something bigger than any human or many humans, they evoke a sense of reverence to them. At least that's my experience with them. I experience them as a union between the earthly things, and sky things, or you could say earth and heavenly things. In as much as heaven, traditionally understood, was the realm of the sky and the clouds, etc. So, we experience a mountain as a union of heaven and earth. People regularly report, and it's the same for me, that on a mountain they feel closer to divinity, or they feel more transcendent, or they feel a deeper touch with reality, right? A mountain is invariably a difficult ascent. There's a sense of difficulty and challenge tied up with a mountain. Many people oftentimes will climb a mountain and then report that it's the hardest thing they've ever done, right? And so the other experience of the mountain is that you have to plan and prepare in order to interact with the mountain. Also, mountains, very often the way we experience them is as a guiding feature in a landscape. Getting back to last episode, they're a landmark, they're a reference point. And in as much as they're a reference point, then a reference point can bring the world to a center, right? And even as you ascend a mountain, also very interestingly, as you ascend a mountain, almost invariably, in order to get to the highest point, you are being drawn in to the central point of the mountain. So the more you ascend and the closer you get to the mountain, the more you're drawn to the central point. There's an attraction, you could say, to a mountain. It's also a place where the higher you ascend the mountain, the more that you see, right? So as you ascend, your vision naturally expands to greater and greater vistas until you get to that very central point of a mountain. And what can you do? You can see everything. You can see everything around you. And this is one of the reasons people report that they ascend mountains, right? They want to get a different perspective on familiar things. They want to get a view from above, if you will, on life and the world. When you engage with the mountain, experience the mountain, it changes you, right? It makes you stronger. In a short sense, it can make you weaker and humble, but as you continue to, experience the mountain, it will make you stronger because of the way it challenges, right? Because of the way it changes your perspective and calls you to something of a higher capability. A mountain is almost universally experienced as beautiful. There's an attraction of beauty to it, not just an attraction to ascend, but an attraction of beauty. So people want to spend time on the mountain. They want to go there, they want to camp, they want to see and appreciate the mountain once they get there. A mountain also has caves and depths that we know to it. So there's a seen part of the mountain, but then there are deep, dark depths, whole worlds going on inside the mountain that usually we don't even experience. They're unexplored. There's all sorts of possibility in the mountains. What's inside those caves? What's inside the heart of the mountain? Is it monsters? Is it treasure? We don't know. That's the unknown, right? And so we know that the mountain has most of it. In fact, we can't see. It's a mystery. Okay, so we have water on most mountains. Water cascades out of and off of mountains. You'll see snow lying on mountains, on the top of it. That's an experience of the mountain. It often enhances its beauty. It's kind of an adornment or a covering on a mountain. You experience cycles on a mountain. You'll see it change over time as the plant growth changes, as the snows come and recede, as there's waterfalls coming out of the mountain and then those die off. And so very much you start experiencing the mountain as a living system. And so because you start seeing, wow, the mountain isn't just one thing, it's many things. And many of these things are alive and connected. There's the water, the plants, the bugs, the mountain goats, the falling rock, again, the caves, and all these things interact in ways that they couldn't exist without each other. The mountain is also experienced as wild, right? There's unpredictability and accidents on the mountain. If you don't prepare properly, the mountain can very much be a destructive experience instead of an enhancing experience. Your interactions with the mountain form themselves into a story and a journey naturally, right? Whenever you go to a mountain, you have started a journey, and that ascent to the top of the mountain and the return back will naturally present itself into a story that you want to tell others. And I think we're about probably 10 minutes into here to just describing the experience of a mountain. I hope you're starting to get, for those that are kind of been joining in, we're talking about the mountain as a symbol and why symbols are so potent and such tiny little seed containers of volumes of information. They're efficient, tiny containers that contain just volumes and volumes of information. So I'm trying to illustrate that by talking about all the things you experience on a mountain. And again, we're about 10 minutes in and we're not done yet, right? Okay, so you can feel sick on a mountain. You can even die on a mountain. So especially if you haven't prepared to ascend a mountain, you can be very sick on it, and many people are. And then we hear of stories of the people that try to climb the highest mountains, if they're not prudent as they do so, if they don't respect kind of the greater forces of life, they can very easily die on that mountain. So you have to acclimatize yourself to climb the mountain, either by climbing smaller mountains, by doing a little bit of it at a time, and until you can handle the mountain and higher parts. Those processes can take years of preparation away from the mountain and then months of preparation on the mountain. Living next to a mountain often defines a whole people. So for example, in Asturias in Spain, one of my favorite places that I refer to often because it's such a magical, meaning-filled place, the people define themselves by the topography, and they define themselves as people of the mountains there in Spain. Switzerland, very much the same thing. You see these people that live in the mountains, and their whole identity is bound up with these mountains. They are mountain people. And people can define themselves by a single mountain. And very often, wherever there's a prominent mountain, the whole culture around it will define themselves in relation to that mountain, that central standing point around them. So example is when I used to live in Utah, in this place called Utah Valley, there's one mountain there that's like the most beautiful prominent mountain. It's called Timpanogos. And so everything is named after Timpanogos. My high school was named after Timpanogos. It was called Timp View, right? Which is a good view of Timpanogos. There's another high school just named Timpanogos High School. Then you have, Timpanogos Dry Cleaners, Timp Rentals, Timp this, Timpanogos that. Again, people can't help but define themselves in relation to a mountain. Okay, so it also, in that call to ascend it, one thing to realize about a mountain, people are called to ascend mountains for no practical purpose, right? There's no resource up at the top. There's no treasure. And yet people feel called to ascend the mountain. And as they do so, nonetheless, they feel changed by the mountain. But not just when they, it is not an uncommon experience to climb a mountain and the mountain changes you as you do it. But then you come back to the world and the world has changed. Because Now you are a person that is a mountain ascender person. And so you look back at the world, and the world around you has changed because now you're amongst people that haven't climbed the mountain. You're amongst one of the 1% of people in your general area who are the mountain climbing people. And now your whole relation to those around you and the world, and what challenge means and what it does and etc. has changed by climbing the mountain. All right, colors on the mountain are important in your experience of it, because of the ways they change even in the course of a day. So that is a part of experience of the mountain. The mountain is constantly changing, yet there is something unchanging about the mountain, something so vitally stable that it has been there for millennia. It will be there. It will always be there, in a sense. And yet, like I said, the mountain is also constantly changing. So there's both this interplay of deep stability that comes from a mountain, but then a process of transformation, a cyclical process of transformation constantly going on with the mountain as well. Okay. Again, there's these things you can either experience elation and transcendence on a mountain, or utter despair and destruction on a mountain. It's worth repeating that. I'm getting finally to the bottom of the list. Again, there's these feelings that people go to the mountain to seek transformation, and that's a key part. You can have ineffable, indescribable feelings on a mountain. People will come and not be able to describe the potent feelings that they had. And I think I'm finally getting to the bottom of my list. So again, we went on there 10, 15 minutes about the experiences of a mountain, and I'm guessing you could probably add some of those to it. Okay. So we said the whole point of this was to show that how in a small container, like this is just the word mountain, right? There can be volumes of information. And how are there volumes of information? The information comes in the form of patterns of experience. Okay? And so that is how a symbol works, is that it is something that is universally experienced by people and then has potent, rich patterns within it that in some way are not just particular to the mountain, but are transferable to reality itself. So the mountain contains a volume of patterns that, in as much as you could hear as I'm saying there, patterns of ascent, patterns of transcendence, patterns of preparation, patterns of beauty that you experience in other places off of the mountain. But in as much as all those patterns are in the mountain, you can see why we experience mountains as so, transcendent and awe-inspiring and reverent, because it's just packed with these patterns of meaning. Okay, so once you understand that and how all that's packed within the concept of a mountain and your experience of it, then you can see why mountains would, one, be natural temples in and of themselves, or that all temples, like across humanity, have nearly always been shaped and made into literal mountains where the same patterns are participated in with the mountain. Okay, I see we've gotten some comments, so I want to jump in on that, and hopefully, this has all been landing good, because I think this is the best way to understand symbols and how they work, is to dive deep into, again, our experiences of many common things that are used as symbols. So as I look at your comments, think about other potent symbols that are like that. Home is another one, right? A home is full of patterns of experience and meaning. The ocean is another such thing that is often used. Water in and of itself, so the various forms that water can take. The earth itself. So anyway, you can think of these universal things that are just filled with patterns of meaning. Okay, Martin, I saw that you were asking for recommendation looks of books and movies that fuel masculinity and deal with the challenges a man faces. I really like your analysis on Blade Runner and Gladiator. So yeah, Martin, I'd be happy to do that. Maybe what I should do is just do that as one of these streams, kind of say, here's my top 20 list of movies and books in understanding manhood. So that's a good suggestion. All right, glad to have you back, Martin. The other Martin Kuchen. And then Martin Anderson, you said, when you take on the challenge of the mountain, climbing it, and get to the top, you receive vision, wisdom, perspective. Yes. And what's so crazy is, certain mountains, like I went and climbed this one mountain, I think called Brecken's Beacons in Wales, in South Wales, when we were there. And it was a Saturday and just a good day for climbing the mountain. So there was a nice trail just going up to the mountain, no trees or anything. So you could see this trail of ascent going to the top of this mountain. And there were, every, 20 meters or so, there's another person. So you can just see this procession of people all going up to the top of the mountain. And every time I see something like that, I just laugh, because I'm like, why are we doing this, right? Because on the one sense, in like a practical, scientific sense, there's no reason to be doing this. The best you could come up with is, I need to exercise my body. And yet, we all know why we're doing it. It's for why Martin just said. There is a sense of transcendence and journey and power and reverence and challenge in climbing this mountain that we know is bound up with transformation. And here you have this procession of hundreds of people making their trip to the top of the mountain, right? It's one of the reasons I love mountains, because they're so undeniably religious, right, in their patterns and the way that we experience them. Okay, Martin Kuchen, I don't know, man, here in Austria, climbing mountains has become a kind of esoteric substitute religion. Yes, that is why, so just like I said, because they're so full of patterns of meaning, even without people realizing what they're doing, because you'll get mountain climbers, that make this their whole life, climbing mountains, and you delve into their, what they're doing. They don't know why they're doing this very often. They can't answer the questions. They know, they don't know it in an articulated sense, let's say that. Of course, they're driven to do it. And when you start hearing them really talk about it, or plumb kind of into them as to why they're doing it, what it comes out is always religious type metaphors. And it makes sense why some people would be like that, because they can't find that type of meaning in the world, right? So they have to find it on a mountain. It's even bound up with concepts of death, right? You'll find that the greatest mountaineers, they have this particular kind of acceptance of death in the community and in the possibility of themselves, which once again, like you look at Christianity, what's at the heart of Christianity? An acceptance of death as part of a transcendent religious experience, So yeah, mountain climbers, they're not doing it for practical reasons. They're doing it for reasons of meaning and that are best described as religious reasons, right? So yeah, glad you brought that up. Christian says, when I climb high in mountains, I can't help feeling it is religious experience. I'm aware how small I am and feel more aware of God. Exactly. You feel closer to God, and you feel this reverence because the mountain itself, you participate in the pattern. See, that's the important thing, participation in a pattern of meaning. So it's not that you're just studying it or reading it in a book. You go there, and the mountain literally is immense and much grander than you, such that you can participate in that feeling of reverence for it, and that and so God, you feel closer to the transcendence, or the greater expanse of God while on the mountain, because you're participating in that same pattern of meaning. Okay, Martin Kuchen says, yeah, but if you don't believe in God, you bring your almost sacral experience down to the dirt and make it profane. Yeah, in some ways, but it's interesting how, I don't look what people say. I look what they do. And so I would just say those people, in as much as belief, I think, is much more tied into action and what we do, I would say those people do believe. You don't even have to say God. They believe in transcendence. They believe in higher things. They believe in the divine, you could say. And, okay, you say, I live in Salzburg under Berchtesgaden. Again, I'm not great with my German. Lots of mountains and tourism. Tourism kills everything. Yeah, that's it's one of these double-edged things in which you want people to be able to travel and see other things in the world and experience these things. But the more that people are made aware of beautiful transcendent spaces, the more they come, and that, I think, definitely defiles them. The more that people come and it turns touristy and whatnot. So, but at the same time, I want to go to many of these places myself. So it's this thing of, if it was done right, right, you still would have these places be places that people could go to, but if they treated them with reverence, not just with novelty, because tourism's so tied up with novelty, right, and commercialism, and ease and vacation and luxury and things like that, whereas um, you know, pilgrimage is a much better thing, I think, for to describe what places should be. If there's a sacred, beautiful place like the top of a mountain, then there should be a sense of, pilgrimage and reverence for anyone that does come and visit those places, such that they maintain the attributes that make that place a sacred or beautiful place, and they don't defile those or destroy them in coming and making their pilgrimage, right? You said, do you know the Himalaya photos of last year where people were stepping over corpse and standing lines to the top? It's absurd, isn't it? Yeah, again, there's something, and of course, why is it there, the Himalayas, why is it Mount Everest that people do that for? Because it's the highest of the places, right? And it's not even the most difficult. A lot of people say that's K2, and other mountains are much more difficult, but they all want to go to the highest place. Why? Because it's symbolically important. And then the other Anderson says, depends on how you look at it. Who can I completely agree that a massive tourist can be overwhelming, destroy the beauty of the challenge. Yeah, so there's a thing where, like, you do want places to be visitable, most of them. Some, I think there's also okay to close off places in the world and have them retain a sense of mystery and exclusion. That's okay too, when not done to excess. So all these things are principles, and they have to be worked out with each available space, and it's not easy, right? And that's been one of my things is, even, I have so much footage and stuff of places in the world that we visited on kind of our pilgrimage of ancestral places in the world. But in a place like Asturias that I've mentioned many times, there's always a little knife in me when I mention that place, because it's one of the less known places of Spain, yet so beautiful and magical. Mostly only the Spaniards know about it, but of course, every time somebody like me mentions it or makes a video or something like that, then more tourists show up who approach it as tourists, right? And so, yeah, and Martin says, I guess it's not the tourists' fault, the natives who own the land are at fault if they let greed control their actions. Yeah, and that's part of it too. Okay, so let's try to bring this all into something that now we say, okay, if we can see how the mountain is such a potent thing, and how the mountain is the prime symbol probably of temples, then what should we draw from that? Well, one is to ask ourselves the question, are these, now that we've seen how potent of experiences are tied up with the temple, you should ask yourself, are those things real, right? And on the one hand, of course they're real, right? They impact people's lives. They transform people's lives. They change behavior. They move people to move their body through space and take actions. They can move people to spend uncounted money and treasure and travel in order to participate in these patterns of the mountain, right? And so in a sense, they are definitely real. And so it's not just real, right? It's what a lot of people would say is the most real thing, in as much as it's tied into personal transformation, meaning, connection with the divine, okay? But here's where I want to put in this contrast, because the whole another part of our world and society, right, constantly teaches us that everything that we just talked about is either not real, or if it is real, it's the less real thing, right? And so now we're going to look back at the mountain, and let's put on our modern goggles, everything we've been given from the modern world, and see how everything we've talked about isn't real at all. It's just an illusion. It's just, chemicals firing within us and neurons and something evolutionary that kind of forces us to do that. It's cute, it's nice that it means so much to people, but it's just an illusion. Everything really is, the only thing that's real there on the mountain is material, right? Either the material of the mountain itself, or the material that's within you interacting in your brain, chemicals and genetic information, all of which is not really real. That's not the real part. It's all just the material part that's happening on it. So, you know, here's what a mountain really is. The mountain is just a pile of rock, right? It's essentially formed as such, and such tectonic plate came in contact with another tectonic plate roughly 3.5 million years ago. The mountain has a elevation of 5,000 meters and a prominence of such and such amount of meters. Here are the GPS coordinates of the mountain and the way that it forms on there. Here is the makeup of the stone on the mountain. You know, here's its classification. It's mostly limestone in this way. Then there was this, volcanic eruption in part of it. So there's some igneous rock in this part. And over here, there is a field of wildflowers that are, here's the scientific name for these wildflowers and how they germinate with this particular insect that's on the mountain. So, you can see that's how a lot of the world teaches us to handle the mountain. Even those people that are climbing the mountain, of course, Strava is maybe, which is one of these athletic apps, is maybe the thing that they're depending on most. Oh, I've traveled this much. Here's the elevation of what I've done. I burned this many calories. Okay, I need to fuel up and put enough energy into myself to handle the mountain. And so, good. I just want you to see that contrast of how we're kind of taught to, the world conditions us to see the mountain in this whole different way, and how in as much as you stay in that framing, because it's not to say that framing doesn't have certain values in the world, but if we put that as the primary framing of the mountain, you miss all that other stuff, right? It takes away all the meaning from what's going on in the mountain. It takes away our recognition of the transformation of the mountain, of the ties to divinity. And so the reason I bring that up is because this is exactly what happens in religion, and the reason we go to temples and we don't have those same transcendent experiences that we would like on a mountain. Because we come into a temple and we instantly go into kind of scholastic mode, the mode that we're kind of prepared to do. What are the main presentations we're given to us in temples now if we're like visiting one as a tourist? It's usually the historical kind of when it was built and here's the materials and maybe some facts, lots of facts about the temple itself. And again, when I'm talking about temple, this could easily apply to cathedral, many churches, any sort of holy site, stone circles. Let's see, what else? Mountain holy sites, such as in the Holy Land, there's a lot of sacred mountains. Any sort of shrine or temple, it's all the same. Like when you go and visit them today, this is the kind of presentation you're given: historical, scientific, datings, etc. And so you're looking at it from mainly the scholastic, physicalist perspective, or perspective in terms of kind of historical, modern academic historical perspective. Okay, so you can see why you would go to a temple and it'd be kind of neat and novel, but maybe you wouldn't feel the same things that you naturally feel, as we said, and experience in the mountain. And so if you want to understand temples, period, and this goes for the Latter-day Saint temple or any other temple, the worst thing you can do as far as understanding what they were really there for in terms of a society or a people, or especially if there's still temples that you can participate in with a living culture today, in as much as so many religions still have temples, Hindu temples, mosques and synagogues and cathedrals, and again, Latter-day Saints, we have our temples, which are different from our meeting houses. Yeah, the worst thing you can do is go in there and stay in this academic mindset, you could say, that you've been taught through all of your schooling. Because if you do that, you'll miss all that realm of experience and symbolic experience that we have been talking about, that is contained within the symbols of the temple. Because all these symbols, they are not historical per se in the modern academic sense of historical, and they are not they are not meant to be to bear the standards, let's say, of modern scientific physicalism and materialism. But the problem is that because our world's become so like that, a lot of religions will try to get everything that used to be contained within a temple to fit into that. And that's where we get into silliness in religions, where people make claims that they just can't back up, right? And so, for example, a lot of temples contain origin myths or creation myths, you could say. And I use the term myth as not being something that's not true, but as being a container perennial patterns. So in the temples, it's not just one-off symbols like, okay, there's a mountain you find. Usually all the symbols are contained within a story, within a drama within the temple, okay? And so if you go and you look at that drama or story and you try to again, look at it through the goggles of modern history or science, you're either gonna discount it and say this couldn't possibly be true or real, or you're gonna try to defend it as being, no, it is true or real historically, scientifically, and you're gonna make all sorts of claims you have no ability to back up, right? So both of those perspectives are wrong in the temple. Instead, what you should do, so for example, the Latter-day Saint temple, there is a creation myth, a drama that's contained within the temple, and it's the same one that's in Genesis with a little bit of variation to it. So it's the Adam and Eve story, the creation of the world, etc. And so if you go and you think you're just getting a history lesson as that's presented to you in the Latter-day Saint temple, then okay, you're going to get some facts, and you can either say, oh, these are historical, and I'm going to just treat them as historical, even there's no way you can actually prove that they're historical, right? And then what do you do with that, right? Or again, you can look at it and you can be all flustered because this couldn't possibly be true by this what I've learned in school and the university, and there you'll be flustered looking at the story like that. Or you can look at the story like we were just looking at the mountain. And what does this story contain? It contains a garden, right? It contains heaven and earth. It contains water and dry land and earth. It contains the sun and the moon. It contains a serpent. It contains fruit. It contains trees. And that's where you say, okay, given what we've been talking about with symbols today, go back to all these symbols and the way that they're used in the context of this story, and get back into the mountain mode, the experience of the mountain mode, like we were on those, and say, what are the universal kind of ways that we experience these common things, such as a tree, such as a fruit, such as a serpent in life. And this is where Jordan Peterson, it was so potent with a lot of people when we delve into the biblical lecture series, is because he started talking about things, more in this way of meaning, right? What does the serpent mean? Well, humans have universal reactions to serpents. They get us to change and transform, right? They produce an instant transformation of state in us when we see them. We freeze to them because they're terrifying. And when you look at how serpents are used in humanity across all sorts of different stories and contexts, they're almost always bound up with transformation, change, monsters, things like that. And so you start seeing, okay, that's how I should be looking at this serpent, right? And you do the same thing with the garden. You do the same thing with the presentation of as the creation of the world, like you find it in Genesis, where you start out with heaven and earth. You very soon have light and darkness. You have these kind of chaotic waters being presented with the Spirit of God hovering over them. And again, instead of looking at it with your historical goggles on, you take those off and you look at them with your goggles of meaning and symbols, and seeing all those as being containers of information and patterns of meaning within those, okay? And so if you can do that, then you'll see that basically every aspect of temples, of any faith, of any kind of tradition, have those kinds of symbolic containers within them. And you go and you try to, again, unpack the patterns of meaning found within those containers. And in as much as you do, that's when you feel, the feelings in that temple, and you experience the transformation that the temple was actually supposed to have on you, just as like when you're climbing the mountain. And so, of course, it's very hard with a lot of temples that we visit, because the real essence of what was offered there in the temple was bound up with the rituals that were done with them. And what's a ritual? Again, participation in patterns or dramas, or eating or burning things and sending smoke up to the heavens, or a procession, or sacrifices, all these things, or the most basic ritual people know of in terms of the Eucharist or communion, where you're eating this bread and this wine that is bound, that are, even though those things, bread and wine, are potent symbols, in as much as we all have experiences with them, and then it's tied up with an even higher symbol, which is, God himself, and you're ingesting, God himself in this, something that is both profound in the way that, people are making God part of themselves, but also shocking in the sense that this is cannibalism at the same time. And so there's both this shock and this deep, deep participation, I guess you could say, with God, bound up into the same symbols and stuff. So again, I'm just trying to get you, not trying to, it'd be impossible to go into all the potent symbols that are out there in every temple, but I just want you to see how to approach these things such that you can actually gain the insights and hopefully experience the transformations that are found within temples. Because what I find is, even in my own tradition, people go to the temple, and again, they think they've been given a history lesson. They've got the right facts. Okay, so I've got the facts now, and someday I'll use those facts in some context, like maybe to get into heaven or something like that. That's kind of a little bit the way the temple presentation of the Latter-day Saints could appear if you took it that way, right? And it's like, great, okay, maybe that's so, but how, it's so much more potent of experience if you go and experience the ritual and the symbols. You pull out the patterns of meaning, and then instantly you're transformed, and you come out of the temple and you're able to apply those patterns of meaning in your daily life that day, right? Or as you continue to think about the symbols, because you'll unpack more and more meaning from within them, you experience greater transformation over time and ability to apply those symbols to daily life. And you contrast those two experiences with a temple, and of course I'd take the more transformational one that applies right now, rather than facts that you're just supposed to remember for some future event or something like that, right? Okay, that's I think what I wanted to say about that today. And now I'm going to come, and it looks like you have a few more comments, and we'll go over those and then wrap this up. Okay, I guess, let's see. So, looks like Martin had to go. Yeah, Martin, you said the brass serpent. Exactly, right? The brass serpent. And that's the cool thing about the serpent, too, is that, this is the thing about symbols. Everything should be seen in its context, because a serpent, in one sense, could be a negative thing. So many people treat the serpent in the garden as a negative thing, or if it's a serpent such as, a giant sea monster, a leviathan in the ocean that's going to eat people up, it can be a negative thing. However, the brass serpent, held up there by Moses, was a symbol of transformation, but it was also a symbol that everybody looked to at the same time, and it brought unity and overcoming of a death, of a plague, of a venom at that moment, when there were the other serpents at the same time. And so that's another key about symbols and symbolic language, is you always have to analyze. You can't just think that there's a symbolic dictionary, right? That you're saying, oh, serpents always mean this, so every time you see a serpent, it must mean this. They don't work that way. Instead, you have to kind of apply the attributes of the serpent to the context in which it's being used. And so, yeah, the brass serpent held up on a pole is not exactly the same as the serpents that were biting people in that context. You have to say, what's going on there? with the brass serpent as opposed to the serpents that are biting people. In many ways, it probably is still tied into that serpent in the beginning of Genesis, but you have to analyze each instance of the serpent in its context, right? Martin, you also say the Romans thought that the first Christians were cannibals, and they said they should stop with the Eucharist, but they refused. They said there's no Christian without the Eucharist, and so they died. Life would be dull without rituals or traditions. Yes, and that's another thing that I'm hoping I'm transmitting through this series is the importance of rituals or traditions, which is why, one, I recommend that even for those that have never had like a religious tradition, you try to find at least some baseline tradition you can join into to give you, because otherwise you have to create them all for yourself, right? And that is nearly impossible to kind of create a comprehensive tradition of rituals, where again you can rituals are just participations with other people, usually to align your minds into certain patterns of meaning. And through this series, as we get into the actual specific rituals, like in the Latter-day Saint Temple, we're going to show how that works more. But the Eucharist is one of the best examples of how you gather this body of people, and all of you at the same time say, we are all as the same body, eating this same body, in this way that is supposed to be both shocking and transcendent, of eating our actual deity, right? But in that way, making him part of us and making part of all of us at once, as much as it's this communal experience of communion, right? Then you see how potent these rituals can be, and why we still need them, and why, again, even if we say, oh, our world, it doesn't have them anymore, actually we do. Again, I point you to the sporting arena and all the rituals that go on there, the joint shouting of chants, again, music is brought into it, chanting, parading, dressing up as kind of pagan gods, you could say, whatever the god is that's identified with the body of that club and everything. You can see how we cannot help but participate in ritual, and you just have to say, okay, which rituals am I participating in? Are they drawing me closer to the God that I want to be drawn closer to, and not just whatever God is kind of thrust upon me by that. So, okay, like Martin says, what's the mountain on the thumbnail? So that is one of the most famous mountains. It's the Matterhorn, and they're in Switzerland. And so, I thought that should use one of the most famous ones. It's funny how certain, this is a question to ask yourself. Why is it that certain shapes of mountains are more impactful to us than others, right? So certain, a lot of mountains that don't have, it's kind of important that they be cliffy at the top. Oftentimes that's one thing that oftentimes makes them more meaningful to us, more striking, more captivating. If the least kind of impactful mountain is just a very kind of flattish hill with little variation on it, little tree, no trees or things like that, and very flat, right? We almost don't even see it when we're driving by it. Then on the other hand, there's these other kinds of mountains, that oftentimes they have trees starting at the bottom, maybe some snow, cliffy at the top, and then it's so often the shape as well. Like the Matterhorn, it has to, part of it is the shape of the Matterhorn. The way that it's shaped is more, it strikes us as beautiful. And why does it strike us as beautiful? My claim with beauty is that beauty is tied up with patterns of meaning. So there's something in us that says that's meaningful. That's more meaningful than this other pattern. It's the same reason of like, why in just a blank overcast sky with no variation, why is that less beautiful than a dazzling sunset with all sorts of colors and clouds and beams of light, coming through the landscape? Why is that a more potent symbol to us? And why do we feel so much more beauty as opposed to the other one? Whereas the other one, maybe it's a symbol too. That blank gray sky that I'm actually looking at right now in Mission Top has tied in with it symbols of kind of melancholy or meaninglessness, you could say, in as much as there isn't the variation and the color and stuff like that. So again, I'm glad you brought this up, because it just gives me a chance once more to show how symbolism happens in our life around us if we pay attention to it. The things that call us out as being meaningful, as being beautiful or ugly, because something ugly is also transmitting a pattern of meaning to you. Or some things transmit a pattern of melancholy. Some things transmit a pattern of transcendence, right? And so, yeah, Christian says they all have different character. Cape Town is pretty much defined by Table Mountain. Yes, another beautiful mountain up there. And it's interesting because that one's more like a table, and so but yet it still comes off as beautiful, right? So very interesting. But then and again, the other interesting thing is how many mountains aren't nearly as captivating, right? And you have to ask yourself, why is that one not, and that one is? That's a profound question, right? Martin, maybe a reminder of our limitation to get up there. Mountains that are just look more ominous and difficult are, by their very nature, more captivating. When they look more challenging, especially when there's the steeper cliffs and peaks, just like, they create that sense in us, right? Christian says, have you seen the Free Solo or the Dawn Wall? Yes, I've seen both of those, both excellent things. And again, you these kind of characters in them, sometimes they're pretty eloquent and be able to explain why they do what they do. Sometimes they're not, and they just do it, because in as much as the symbolism is much more experiential than it is articulated. That's its power, is that anybody can participate in it. You don't even have to understand what you're doing to be impacted by the symbolism. And so, those are movies where I can't even remember which of the two, different characters, that kind of the main characters in those two ones, who talks about it best, and if they recognize the symbolic and religious aspect to what they're doing. But in any case, you can see that what they are doing is trying to fulfill out patterns of meaning, right? Christian says lone mountains are always more captivating. Exactly. That's why volcanoes, for example, along California and up through Washington and Oregon in the United States is this string of volcanoes. Like Mount Rainier is one of them. And in as much as volcanoes oftentimes arise and they're lone mountains, they're always striking whenever they are. Guatemala, where I have a lot of ancestry, also has a lot of volcanoes like that, and they can be like that. But of course, it's not only volcanoes. Sometimes, like the Lone Mountain in The Hobbit, any lone mountain that just is there, boom, in the landscape, becomes the central point of that landscape, becomes the central feature, and oftentimes the most unifying, kind of thing in there as well. Martin, there is this Clint Eastwood film where there is a mountain climber that reminds me of this. I forgot the name. Okay, I'll look that up. Another one somebody brought up to me one time is there's this one there in the UK that's like the man who went up a hill and came down a mountain or something like that. And it's all about this, as I understand it. I got to see it. I haven't seen it, so I wish I could talk about it more in depth. But it talks about how people they kind of define themselves by their mountain by them, but there was a dispute whether it actually was a mountain or not, because I guess by the classifications, it had to have certain characteristics to be classified as a mountain in the story, but it mattered deeply to the people that it be classified as a mountain, because that's more, there's more bound up in the meaning of a mountain than there is a hill. And so again, I don't know the particulars of the way the story played out after that, but I know that was kind of the setup, and in that you can see why it, how it is again that we relate to these things. So I'm glad that everybody, that everybody participates, I guess, in that experience and potency of mountains in the same way that I do, and because it's so cool to see how, if you get that, you can get temples, right? And as much as they're all structured the same ways, they're all structured as an ascent to God. You see how they're bound up with, Moses's ascent and the Mount of Transfiguration in Christianity. But of course, like every tradition has its mountains, and they're very much used always in the same way. They get people closer to God. Information is transmitted from God to a person, and usually they're supposed to go back down the mountain. You know, it's like Moses first went to the mountain with the burning bush, had this transformative experience with God, then was supposed to go back and transmit the information to the Israelites and rescue them from being under the thumb of the tyrant, right? And then bring them back to a holy mountain. And so you see, again, these are the patterns that are out there across religions usually. So yeah, if you can understand a mountain, you can begin to understand temples. Okay, everyone, this one was a fun one for me in as much as I love mountains, but I also love symbolism and the way that the world presents itself to us symbolically. So taking these principles we've established so far, temples being a symbolic world, temples being a map of meaning, we're now more prepared to kind of dive into the more particulars of temples and be able to pull out the transformation that they're meant to influence us with, the information that they contain that is more, again, this participatory symbolic information. So thanks for joining me today, and we'll be back tomorrow with something new. Also working on that polished piece that I have committed to get out this week as well. So have a great day, and this is Gary signing off from Mission Top today.